Hey everyone, RogueGold here. Welcome back to the Division 2. And today I am back with another seasonal build. Now again, just to distinctualize how a seasonal build differs from a regular build, this specifically deals with the modifiers in place for a specific season, in this case Year 6 Season 2 with Point Blank. So if you're watching this after that season, this might not be applicable as those modifiers will no longer be accessible. But today's build spawned in my mind in two places specifically. Firstly, the curiosity sparked in me to make a skill modifier build, meaning since the vast majority of the modifiers that we have available deal with weapon damage only, I thought to myself, could I make one that's viable that focuses on skills instead? And then once I started messing around with that, it dawned on me that a setup like the one you're going to see in this video is the perfect bypass build. What do I mean by that? Well, effects like Requital, right, the hostile modifier that reflects all of the damage back at you within the medium range, this build ignores that entirely because those things do not impact your skills. So, if you're looking for something to help you access the modifier system a little bit easier with less stress, or you just want a fun new combination to try out, I got a feeling you might like this one, and I certainly hope you do. And if you end up enjoying the video and you want to see future builds and coverage on the Division 2 like this, then I would appreciate you clicking that subscribe button if you're not already. We'd love to have you around. But, without further ado, let's go. Alright, and here is the build. Now, as I always like to say, before we get into these, this is just a template, right? This is how I have chosen to set up this build. There are many different variations of how you could do it if you want to go under these same general parameters, or, different ways to set up skills overall. It is all fully player choice, so make the changes you want to make, and I'd be curious to hear about them. But as far as how I have this set up, I want to actually begin with the skills because that is the centerpiece of the build here instead of just my weapons like usual. So the main damage dealer, and what this is all focused around here, is the sniper turret. This is in correlation with one of the modifiers that we have available this season. You could also do this with the assault turret under that same one, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I've chosen to go with the sniper turret, and as I think you saw in the gameplay, this is very versatile, right? It deals at different ranges, which pairs up nicely with how the base seasonal modifier this season works. It's just a nice option. So you see I'm getting tier 6 on this. Because of that, I'm getting 3.3 million damage and all of those stats that you can see there. And then when I go to mod it, you can see down here at the bottom, I have a damage, health, and skill haste mod on there. I did also decide to put a little bit of expertise into this just to make it shine that much more, but that's certainly not mandatory. I think it'll do plenty fine even without that. And then as far as my other skill, we're getting the Artificer Hive, which you only get by using the Technician specialization. That is the one that I recommend the most for this because of the Artificer, right? We're trying to get the most damage possible out of the sniper turret to be able to have the best shot at like one-shotting bosses, which you can't quite do in most of my cases on Heroic, but you can get pretty close with using stuff like this. So again, tier 6, you can see all the stats there, and at the bottom we got the range and health mods. But let's now shift back and talk about the weapons and gear pieces that we're using to make those two skills as powerful as possible. For your weapons, it is ultimately up to you. I'm choosing to run the capacitor as my primary, which a lot of people like. Obviously, you get extra skill damage for shooting enemies. This works super well. It has a very slow decay time, so you don't have to like constantly be shooting to keep this buff up. I've then got the Harmony as my secondary, which a lot of people also like. They love the in-sync talent as far as how they play skill builds. Ultimately, the choice is yours. You could also go with something like the Mechanical Animal to get the perfected version of Future Perfect. That way you'd be getting overcharge and giving your skills even more base stats. So really any of the viable skill options as far as weapons that are going to give you additional skill damage are going to work well. So just pick whichever one you like most. All right, but let's move on to the gear where things really start to matter, right? So firstly, for our mask, we have our first of 3 pieces of Empress International. This is one of the best skill brands because as you can see on the readout, we get 10% skill health, 10% skill damage, and 8% skill efficiency. And for any who don't know, skill efficiency is the skill's equivalent of weapon handling, right? It gives you 1% in every applicable skill stat. So essentially, this is getting us 18% damage for a sniper turret from just these 3 pieces on the brand bonuses, as well as stuff like skill haste and all of that. On this piece, I have a skill tier and then skill damage, skill haste, and a skill haste mod. That is basically what we're going for on every single piece here is skill damage wherever you can get it, and then skill haste. So it's a pretty easy formula to follow. Moving on to the chest piece, I have my second piece of Empress. Again, we covered those brand bonuses on here. Skill tier, skill damage, skill haste, and a skill haste mod with glass cannon. I highly recommend this talent. There are technically other options you could run if you wanted to buff up your skills in different ways, but to get the flat amplified 25% damage for the sniper turret is big. You'll notice that damage difference in gameplay. So if you're able to handle the additional oncoming damage, then I definitely do recommend this. I think you'll like it a lot. And because we're running a gun like the capacitor specifically that gets extra damage for each skill tier that we have, it means that our gun actually does a good amount of damage because we're getting that bonus. Again, glass cannon, we have one red here that we'll get to later. So that was another way that I kind of thought about this as I set it up. Moving on to the holster, we have our exotic item for the build, and that is the waveform holster. Now, this is not the only one that you could run. I definitely tested out and considered running stuff like the BTSU gloves or the Acosta's Go bag. Those two items specifically deal with overcharge, and that is one avenue that you could definitely take this build that I decided not to. For the sniper turret specifically, if we take a peek at it, if you decide to overcharge this thing, not only does it get extra damage, but it also gets a huge rate of fire buff, so you're not waiting that super long recharge time. So there are definitely cases where it can be very useful, and that is, like I said, a totally viable way to go with this build. I just decided to go for the more raw base damage version. So obviously this comes with a skill tier, skill damage, and skill haste. The talent just deals with swapping which of your skills has a 30% damage buff. So again, half the time this is not going to be very useful because it's giving that to the artificer, which doesn't deal any damage on its own. But when this is on the sniper turret side, it's just a very nice buff, and that's kind of how I chose to look at it. It's overall less management than running something like the BTSU or Acosta's, where you have to really keep track of when your overcharge buff is ready. So I kind of just went for the version that had less micromanagement. All right, but with that down, let's then take a look at the backpack. We have our third and final piece of Empress here. This one is not perfect, and you'll see across this build, two of my pieces actually don't fully have the rolls that I would choose for them. And hopefully that demonstrates that even despite those flaws, this build still shines quite well. So on here we have a skill tier, skill damage. I would of course then choose skill haste instead of the headshot damage that I have in that second stat slot. And then I do have a skill haste mod. And then the talent that I have on here is tech support, which of course skill kills increase your total skill damage by 25% for 25 seconds. Unless you are going to be running the Acosta's bag here, I think tech support is definitely going to be your best option. Out of anything else I can think of or tested, just a very nice damage increase that again, you don't have to track. Your sniper turret is going to be getting kills. That will then proc this. It'll have even more damage. Very simple. So yeah, highly recommend that one there. Then for the gloves, we have our first of two pieces of Hannah U for the last pieces here on the build, and those brand bonuses give us 10% skill haste and 10% skill damage. Now, one thing I wanted to mention here, because I was actually looking at my pieces and I thought about doing one Hannah U and one Wyvern, because those two brands will actually give you the same stats like on paper, because you're getting skill haste on the one from Hannah U and skill damage on the one from Wyvern. But because of the brand buffs and nerfs that they did with this update, you will actually be getting less numbers if you run Wyvern, because it's 8% now for the one piece instead of 10. So if you want to construct your build like this, I definitely do recommend doing two Hannah U specifically, because that will get you that 2% extra skill damage. But yes, those are those two stats on there. I then have weapon damage for my core on this one. That is because when you run Technician, you get the free skill tier. So unless you want to essentially have 7 skill tiers, which does nothing for you statistically, you want to make sure that one of your other pieces is either going to have weapon damage or armor on it, so that you're not wasting that stat. And so because I'm running glass cannon, because I have the capacitor, which already deals a good amount of damage, I thought why not bump it up even more. And again, as you saw and will see in the gameplay, it deals a lot of damage on its own. I would even have to think about the sniper turret all that much. I've then got skill damage and weapon handling. Again, I would choose skill haste over that weapon handling, but skill damage is the more important stat, so that's why I made sure to get on those two pieces there. And then finally, we have the knee pads, which again are second piece of Hannah U. Skill tier, skill damage, skill haste. Alright, so that's all great, but by now you're probably wondering, how do the modifiers factor into all of this? This looks like a fine build, but how is it going to go through? Stuff like requital and all of those different things. Well, if we take a look at the modifier readout here, it's quite simple. We have all out for our active modifier. None of these three specifically pertain to skills to the best of my knowledge, so it's actually not too important what you choose to run here. I choose all out because, as you saw in the gameplay, it's pretty easy to get the long range one active, because the kills from your sniper turret will actually count for this, even though it doesn't receive the additional damage. So it's just an easy way to activate that long range buff for the capacitor, which again deals a ton of damage. But then the passive modifiers are where this really counts. We're going to skip to this one right here because this is the centerpiece for this entire build. Peak engineering is one of the multi-zone modifiers that you can get right there, and as you'll read, it says assault and sniper turret skills now benefit from the amplified damage bonus granted by the range zones. What does this mean? Well, if we go into the range very quickly, I can demonstrate, and it's quite simple. Basically, if I didn't have that on, the sniper turret would just deal normal damage to all of these different enemies that are downrange here, right? For this one specifically, it deals damage there. But when we have peak engineering equipped, it means that any range that these enemies are in, again on the dial that you can see when I aim at enemies, the sniper turret is getting that additional damage. So if we go back into the modifier menu, that would mean that for short range, the sniper turret is getting 1.2 times amplified damage, medium 1.35, and long range 1.5. So essentially it is just a nice damage buff. And as you saw in the gameplay, that is what allows this to do so well, because we're really just giving this as much power as it has probably ever had in the history of the Division 2. And it means specifically that when we're dealing with those farthest ranges, if I set this to an elite down here, that is when the sniper turret is going to start dealing some serious damage. As you saw, that almost one-shot it. So yeah, that's the general gist there. Then to quickly take a peek at the other two, like I said, peak engineering is really the only one that matters a ton. Otherwise than that, I chose quicken because we're dealing with skill, so any little cooldown reduction we can get, I'm going to take. And then I also put on retribution so that we can build that extra crit chance, since I have 0 crit stats on my capacitor, but it is honestly not that important. Whatever other two you want to run besides peak engineering, feel free to experiment around with and let me know what you like. All right, and there is the build, my friends. It is a lot of fun. It feels very satisfying to mow through these enemies with effects like requital and all of that with no consequences, basically. So in light of that, I will be very curious to hear what y'all think of this one. Any changes you would potentially make to it if you were going to run it. You know, maybe some of you would opt to run with overcharge instead. Do you have any other ideas for skill specific builds under this modifier set? Or in general, as always, any new loadouts you've discovered and are running, I'm always curious to hear about them. So leave any and everything down below. That is going to do it for me today though, folks. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. RogueGold. Ow.